Y'all know what's going on. It's time for another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Bacon. Welcome to the show, y'all. Walking into a federal penitentiary is like stepping onto another planet. A colder and harder and more unforgiving one. Dayon was no longer just a kid from the block who had made a mistake. He was a federal inmate, a man with a long number and a longer sentence. And he had to learn to survive in a world where his sharp mind was not as valuable as a sharp piece of metal. He spent the first few years in a fog of a quiet and profound depression. The guilt of what he had done to his friend, to his mother, was a constant and heavy weight on his soul. He did his time a ghost in the machine, working in the laundry, reading books in his cell, trying to disappear into the gray and monotonous routine of the prison. He heard about Ray sometimes through the prison grapevine. He was in a different and lower security facility doing his 5 years trying to piece his own and shattered life back together. And he heard about his mother. She had lost a house. She was living with his aunt. Her health, which had been the reason for this whole and tragic affair, was failing again. This time, under the weight of a broken heart. Every piece of news was another twist of the knife in his own and deserving gut. He started to change. The quiet and intellectual kid began to be replaced by a harder and more cynical man. He learned the politics of the yard, the brutal and unwritten laws of survival. He learned that in here, you are either a predator or you are prey. And he chose to be a predator. He started to use his mind again, not to create, but to destroy. He got involved in the prison's black market, running a gambling ring, a loan sharking operation. He was a natural at it. He was a king in a cage, building a new and more brutal kind of empire. He was becoming the very thing he had never wanted to be, a gangster, a criminal. A man who lived by the cold and unforgiving logic of the game. The good and decent kid who had just wanted to help his mom was dead. And in his place was a new and harder man. A man who was a product of the very system that was designed to break him. Years in a cage have a way of grinding a man down to his essential truth. For Dayon, that truth was a cold and hard and brilliant mind. And he was using that mind to not just survive, but to conquer. His operation on the inside was a masterpiece of a quiet and efficient brutality. He ran the numbers, the drugs, the protection rackets. He had a crew of loyal and violent soldiers. He was a shot caller, a man of respect and fear. He had become a prison version of the very man he had once protected. Smooth. He heard that Ray had been released. He felt nothing. No guilt, no regret. Ray was just a ghost from a past life, a life that no longer had any meaning to him. He was a different man now, a man who had made his peace with the darkness. His mother died in his 10th year inside. He got the news in a letter from his aunt. He read the letter in his cell, his face a mask of stone. He didn't cry, he didn't rage, he just folded the letter and put it away. The last and most fragile link to the man he had once been was gone. And in his place was just a cold and empty silence. He was a king in a kingdom of cages, but his kingdom was a lonely and desolate place. He had power, he had respect, but he had no one. He had traded his heart for a crown, and he was beginning to realize that it was a bad and foolish bargain. The life of a prison king is a short and violent one. There is always a younger and hungrier lion waiting to take your place. Dayon knew this. He lived every day with a target on his back, and he was tired. Tired of the constant vigilance, the constant violence, the constant and grinding emptiness of it all. He started to think about the man he had been, the quiet kid who loved his mom, and he started to wonder if there was any of that kid left in him. He was a man at a crossroads in the middle of a concrete desert, and he had to make a choice. Continue down the path of the king, the gangster, the monster, or try to find his way back to the man he had once been. A man he had thought was dead and buried a long, long time ago. The change in Dion was a quiet and almost imperceptible one. He didn't have a sudden and dramatic conversion. He just started to pull back. He delegated the running of his empire to his lieutenants. He started spending more time in the library, less time in the yard. He started to read again, not law books, but philosophy, history, poetry. He was a man on a quiet and desperate search for his own and lost soul. He started to write. He wrote letters to his mother, the mother who was no longer there to read them. He told her everything, the whole and sordid and tragic story of the man he had become. It was a confession, a prayer, a final and desperate attempt to reconnect with the one and only person who had ever truly loved him. His crew saw the change. They saw the king abdicating his throne, and in the brutal and unforgiving world of the prison, that was a sign of weakness. A challenge was coming. He knew it, and he knew he had a choice. He could fight and die for a crown he no longer wanted, or he could just walk away. He chose to walk away. He called his top lieutenant a young and ambitious killer, and he just gave him the kingdom. "It's yours," he said. "I'm done." The lieutenant was stunned. He thought it was a trick, but he saw the look in Dion's eyes, the look of a man who was truly and finally finished with the game. Dion became a ghost again. He was a man without a crew, without protection. He was a target, but he was also a man who was no longer afraid to die. He had already died a long time ago. And in that fearlessness, he found a new and strange kind of power. He started a support group for the lifers, the old heads who had been forgotten by the world. They would sit in a circle in the library and they would just talk about the lives they had lost, the families they had destroyed, the ghosts they lived with. It was a quiet and profound and healing thing, a small and fragile island of humanity in a sea of a brutal and dehumanizing world. Dion had found his new purpose. He was no longer a king, he was a healer. He had taken the wreckage of his own and broken life, and he was using it to help other broken men piece themselves back together. It wasn't a kingdom, it was just a community. And it was a more powerful and lasting thing than any empire he had ever built. And so we come to the end of the story of the check cashing gone wrong. A story that started with a simple and desperate act of a son's love, and that ended in a long and winding and tragic journey through the darkest corners of the human soul. Dion was a man who had been a ghost, a king, and a healer. He had lived a dozen different lives in his 20 years in that cage. He was released on parole, an old man, his youth a memory of a different and more violent man. He went back to his old neighborhood. It was different now, but the ghost was still there. He found his friend Ray. Ray was a broken man, haunted by his own in brief time in a cage and by the betrayal of the friend he had once trusted with his life. They sat on a park bench, two old men, the silence between them heavy with the weight of their shared and tragic past. There were no easy apologies, no simple forgiveness, just a quiet and mutual understanding of the wreckage they had both survived. Dion dedicated the rest of his life to the work he had started on the inside. He started a nonprofit for the families of the incarcerated, a place of healing, of hope, of a community for the forgotten. He had taken the poison of his own life and he had turned it into medicine for others. In this story, it's a reminder that the line between a good man and a monster is a thin and blurry one, and that sometimes the choices we make for love can lead us to the darkest of places. But it's also a story about the possibility of a second act, a chance to rebuild, to atone, to find a new purpose. Dayon had lost everything, but in the end he had found himself, the real himself, the one that had been buried under a mountain of guilt, of rage, of a cold and brutal ambition. And that is a kind of freedom, a kind of wealth that no bank, no hustle, no prison can ever take away. This has been another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Baker, and I say peace, y'all.